Hello, and welcome to part 6, the final video in the Halloween sampler roll series. Now today we're covering a lot of material. We'll have our last prompt, our final prompt number 5, to complete our sampler roll with different prompts all along the way that I hope inspired you to make your design completely unique. We'll talk about ways to finish the roll, adding a backing to the completed fabric roll. And then we'll finish the spool that we repurposed from an old ribbon roll. So let's get started, and thank you for joining me. So now for our last prompt, we're going to add texture, and we're going to do that with slow stitching. So take a look at your roll, and this will take the longest probably of all the techniques, and find some areas that you want to add texture to. Now you can add a series of slow stitching in any stitch you want, or even multiple stitches. They don't have to be just one. But I'm going to take a circle. I just like that shape. It can be any shape. And I'm going to create a lot of circles. And I'm going to trace that with my Frixion pen here. I'm just going to trace a bunch of circles going right off my sampler roll here. And I'll choose different sizes. Some circles will be complete. Some will be partial circles. Some will overlap. Look for a smaller size here. And I'll throw in some circles just to overlap the different textures I already have on my sampler roll. Do a few more here and there. And then I'll choose my thread and start stitching. And here I have an abundance of thread. I have some metallic thread, which I think will show up beautifully on the darker colors. I have my traditional black, white, and orange. And I'll just make those little shapes throughout. So I'll start here with this white thread, because I think it'll really show up on the black background and the yellow fabric. And I'll just start anywhere I want on that circle, and I'll complete a stitch all the way around. It could be individual stitches, split stitch, stem stitch, whatever you like, and it's just the magnitude of the stitching that will add the interest. So take your time and complete your slow stitching texture in the colors that you're inspired for your piece. And again, they don't have to be traditional Halloween colors. So I'm just making my stitch, and before I pull it snug, I'm coming halfway in each stitch here. And I'll continue on this all the way around. So I did all my stitching, I did lots of circles, I used lots of fall colors, and I even used that metallic thread just to break up the dark areas. So I'm very pleased with how that came out. So now to finish my piece, I think I'm going to add a couple more charms. I'll just put them in here in various places, again, to break up some of that area. So I'll just stitch these on. So now with just some dark thread, I'm going to stitch on these additional charms. And I can stitch them any way I want. I can go through that initial ring right at the top of the charm, or I could stitch through any part that I want. So this one has some eyes, so I think I'll just come up through those eyes. And that just really anchors it in place. So now I have a couple more steps in order to finish my sampler roll. What I like to do is take some ribbon and put it on the back of this sampler roll. It's okay to show all my stitches and knots, but I like to just cover it up. And because I'm using lace ribbon, it won't cover it up completely. It will just give a somewhat finished edge. When I flip it over, you'll see just a teeny bit of lace peeking through. So I'll stitch that on very lightly up and down the length of the ribbon. So I'll just flip my piece over. I have my sampler roll and my ribbon here. And I'll just use tiny stitches to anchor it in place. I'll start my knot in between the sampler roll and the lace. And then I'll just make teeny stitches down the length of it to hold it in place. So I'll go down the length and then come up the back end. So here is the completed fabric roll. The backing has this tea stain lace, as you can see, and I just stitched up and down it with my black thread. And I've got the completed roll here. I have all these additional stitches right on there. So I have the basic roll from our first class, all 5 prompts from the remaining classes, additional stitching just to hold it together, as well as the lace on the background to finish it. And now I just want to finish the spindle or the spool where I'll store this. So now to cover my spool, I just took my spool and traced around the edge to get the exact size of this top because I'm going to cover this. This is just a piece of chipboard. I have some cotton battings cut to the same size, and then I have 2 pieces of paper. I tried this with fabric and it was just a little too bulky for me. So I'm just going to use the paper. So I take it and then I cut out my circle on the chipboard. Doesn't have to be perfect. If there are any wobbly edges, just cut them off. And if anything, you want your circle to be just slightly smaller than your piece of your spool. First thing I want to do on my spool, though, is just take a permanent marker and color the ends, the color that matches my paper. And I'm going to take my fabric tack, and I like this glue because it dries kind of still flexible and without too many bumps. I'll set it right on top here of my piece, and then I'll also set it right on top of my chipboard circle. Put my batting circle right on top of that. And then I'll take my paper. I'll put this down, eyeballing the center of it, more or less. And then I'm going to start folding it like I would crimp a pie. Pull one part in, hold it down in a piece, and I'm just trying to get a nice little edge. So I fold the next piece in, and I go around. And then I fold the next piece, and so on. Once I have that down, I'll just press it down firmly, and then I'll take it to my spool, adding a little more glue here. Right up to the edges. And then I'll push this right down on top. And then I'll take some clamps just to hold it in place. And I'll let this dry overnight. I'll do the same thing on this side using the remaining pieces. So I've let the spool dry, can remove all these clips that held it in place. I have the paper glued to the batting, which is then glued to this spool to make it reusable. And I went over the edge with that Sharpie. So now, even though it's not a perfectly round shape, I can just take my fingers and kind of press those points down just to make them a little more subtle. But other than that, I have a nice little covered spool. And now it's time to assemble my finished sampler roll. I take my sampler roll and I find the end that I want to attach to the spool. And then I just take a little piece of masking tape. This is a temporary way to hold it here because for now I'm just going to display it in the spool. But if I didn't want to do that, if I wanted to cut it up or use it in my art, I'll do it that way and I can take it out. I just put the tape on the back on itself just to give it a little stick, and then I can wrap my spool. And I gently just wrap it. And I have my completed spool. I like to take a pin and just stick it in. And sometimes I'll stick a bead on that pin just to make it stand out a little further. And there I have my spool. If I want to look at it, I can take out that pin and take a look at the entire Halloween sampler roll that we made with the 5 prompts. We have the swatches, the text, the ghost, the spider, of course, the candies, and the buttons, along with the texture that we added, and I chose to use circles for all this slow stitching. I'll just wind up my roll, and I'm all done with my Halloween sampler roll for this year. So I hope you found this series helpful and fun and really inspired you to create your own sampler roll. I have a series of new videos coming up with more slow stitching ideas, including a really fun one and a long one for Christmas time. Thanks for joining me.